Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
On May 25, 2020, a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd. His death led to a massive protest movement across the United States.
Today marked another day of mostly peaceful protests in cities and towns across the country as demonstrators call for change in the wake of George Floyd's death.
You can see police here now firing tear gas into the crowd. They are trying to push these folks back.
A 12th day of demonstrations in dozens of cities, demands for justice and change, not just in the name of Floyd, but for African Americans, saying they have long been victimized by systematic racism in America.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we reflect on what has and has not changed in the 5 years since George Floyd was murdered. Later in the show, we hear a journalist from the Marshall Project. He'll talk about whether there have been changes in rates of police violence since 2020. But first, we take a look at the protests of 2020 in historical context to understand the ways they succeeded and failed. Alvin Tillery Jr. is professor of political science and founding director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. Professor, it's wonderful to have you on Disrupted.
Thanks. It's great to be on your show, my friend.
This is an episode where we're reflecting on 5 years since the murder of George Floyd and all of the protest movements since 2020. Sometimes it's hard to believe that we're already 5 years past, and other times it's hard to believe that we're only 5 years past. Take us back to 2020 and what you were thinking about as you were seeing those protests play out, but also the responses. Where were you in the thinking in 2020?
Well, in 2020, I was, and I am a scholar of protests, right? I've written a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement, and my first book was about the long civil rights movement starting in the 19th century up through the end of the 20th. And so I was really struck by the fact that for the first time in American history since the abolitionist movement, we were able to mobilize a large multiracial crowd to go into the streets with consistent protest activity. Now, we've had multiracial protest movements before. Of course, there were, white freedom riders, people like Jim Swerd and Annette DeLuzzo, they were great white martyrs of the civil rights movement, but they were a tiny, tiny minority of people who were participating. And so for the first time since the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and 50s, we had mass protests that featured, large white crowds. And that's something that we hadn't seen in our country in the television age. And so that's what really struck me. I was also really, impressed by the fact that the movements were led by our young people, that women were visibly at the forefront. We know that women have been the backbone of almost all of our protest movements from an organizing standpoint. But the fact that they were, at the podium, at the microphones, on the news, interviews, that's what was really different about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was also impressed by how long they were able to sustain it, 100 or more days. So I was thinking, wow, this is amazing. But I was also thinking there's going to be a huge backlash. And I think that's what we are experiencing now.
I appreciate you laying out that context because I think many people think movements just occur, that it's just a couple of people sitting around with a grievance or an idea, and then you have a movement. And what you've just laid out is that it actually does not just happen that way. It may be an event or moment that feels spontaneous, but that long organizing, the long preparation, the strategizing about not just when and how, but who, and who will be involved in that. And when you say you were impressed about how long it endured, those 100 plus days, I think, Professor, some people would say, well, what do you mean only 100 days? But as a scholar of movements, you know how hard it is to sustain that. Talk to us more about the sustaining of protests, but also, as you just said, the backlash in the response. What are we seeing there?
I think a lot of people they have a sort of ahistorical frame on movements, right? And so I think they look back at the movement of our grandparents, right, from like say 1945 to 1968, what we call the classic civil rights movement, and they valorize that as this kind of ideal time where everything went perfectly, and there were just these kinds of opportunities that were created, but they don't see that that movement stood on 50 years of prior organizing, right? And that the conditions that created that movement were particular to that time. And I think what we lost with the Black Lives Matter movement is so many of the young people who don't know that history, because it's not taught in the schools, intentionally not taught. They were valorizing their participation in the movement, their going out into the streets, their rejection of the old order, but they didn't have a plan for what Dr. King used to call the negotiated phase, right? And so that's why, the Black Lives Matter movement really dissipated very quickly. But people still remember those 100 days, and they remember participating in the movement as a great thing because it was a great thing. But the backlash was allowed to bubble up in part because there were no mechanisms for keeping direct pressure on the corporations, the media entities that covered the movement, and we didn't hold Democratic politicians accountable for delivering on many of the promises that were made in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And so, when you have a movement like Black Lives Matter, you have this same set of people who stood out in the schoolhouse doors to bar the Little Rock Nine. Some of those folks are still alive. I mean, think about Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, for example. Like, he was out there, right, as a teenager. But like the children and grandchildren of those people that have always tried to block us from opportunity, when they saw Black Lives Matter, they started to organize immediately. Right. And they weren't valorizing, protests. They're valorizing laws and, corporate power and things that are meant to really keep us in check. And I think that's the lesson that I hope our young activists learned from the backlash, is that, you've also got to have that follow-up plan, that plan for what Dr. King called the negotiated settlements.
Let's talk about power in the context of those negotiated settlements. We are in a time when there's a lot of distrust in institutions, in organizations. We've seen a decline in those elements of public and civic life. And so while during the civil rights movement, to a lesser extent, the women's movement, you had some of those organizational features that could take the baton and go to the next phase. Mm-hmm. You did not see that in this movement. And I think what happened, Professor, is that there were others who took over the power and set the terms of what people wanted. So I always say to my friends, at no point in 2020 did I say, the way to address what's happening is for the NFL to start singing Lift Every Voice, right? That is not the substantive change. But you had people who jumped in with these symbolic virtue signaling approaches that were not being lifted by the people most affected by this. And then in turn, the people most harmed by those demands were Black and brown people, young people who were saying, all we're saying is don't kill us. We're not asking for you to put up this banner. Mm-hmm. How did this backlash in the context of power, the retreat we've seen by not just corporations, but by universities, you and I work on college campuses, mm-hmm. How did that notion of power and who was at the table and setting the terms, how did that play out in what you see now?
First of all, I want to say the symbolic responses shocked all of us, right? I mean, I'm 54 years old. I integrated my neighborhood. I'm a lynching survivor. Like, I never expected white folks to be texting me, like, acquaintances from my LinkedIn, like, hey man, how are you doing with this George Floyd thing? And it's like, it's taken me aback, but then I had to think, that's a very nice thing. Like whether or not it lasts, that's a very nice thing given what my frame on this country. Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C., a city that was built by our slave ancestors, that's a very nice thing, right? And so I do think that a lot of people took the substance, the symbolic, gestures has wins, right? But I do think that there's this deeper organizing that didn't happen, and it didn't happen in part because I think the people who were elevated to leadership roles in the Black Lives Matter movement, weren't really prepared for their mantle. I think that, this notion that, oh, we're a horizontal movement, we don't have any leaders, but hey, like some of us are getting Netflix deals, or hey, some of us are getting, $90 million checks from the Ford Foundation. Like this changes the dynamic in ways that no one was prepared for. And I think what you're hinting at is that in some ways these movements were co-opted by, powerful institutions like the NFL, like Facebook, like, that wanted to just market to the white people who were now interested in anti-racism. And some of them, and I do a lot of consulting work, some of them were afraid of their workers, their young millennial and Gen Z workers. And so that all is true. But the thing that troubles me most, and as someone I still think of myself as in struggle, right? Like working on elections, working on mobilizing young people, someone who's still in struggle, I also think that rank and file black middle class folks really value representation in ways that diminish their power. And what do I mean by that? It's like, so, when white folks found out there's a black national anthem and the NFL is going to sing it and the NBA is going to sing it, a lot of folks were like, yes. And you see all the posts about who's doing the song and black excellence. Oh my God, Bay's going to do it. Right? Like it's, and it's like, and all of that is clearly exciting, but representation does not equal power. I say to my students all the time, when Dr. King and Miss Rosa got the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, there were 5 black members of Congress, and Congress was a segregated institution. There are 63 black members of Congress today, and they couldn't get the George Floyd Policing Act passed, right? And so representation is not power. And that's the biggest lesson that I took away from 2020's backlash, is that in these states like Oklahoma and Florida, where they immediately set to passing laws like, if there's a Black Lives Matter protest, you can run over the protesters and you won't be charged with manslaughter or murder, right? Like that is a demonstration of power that black people have not yet figured out how to deploy on our behalf to help us, because they're locked into funding relationships or political dynamics like the Democratic Party that always moderate their calculations about what they should be doing. And sadly, I think the same was true for the young people that led the Black Lives Matter movement. It's like, well, we don't want to get shot like Malcolm and Martin did, so we're gonna do this Netflix movie, right? It's like that's not power, right?
Given those ceilings and those constraints, we're now seeing some protest around the current administration in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Those protests, the people leading them, however you define a protest, don't generally look like the same people who were most in the streets during the Black Lives Matter movement and during other pieces. And there is this sort of raging debate about who should show up. Who should be leading those protests? Who should be leading those actions? And those debates are happening in a multiracial, multi-generational way, where many of the Black people that I've spoken with have said, let other people do that work. We're still dealing with the scars of 2020. And others are saying, given the nature of power, you can't afford to cede that to others and expect them to represent your interests. And by others, I don't just mean non-Black people. I mean even elected officials who have their own agenda that is often about their interests at the sake of the collective interest.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I am heartsick by where we are in terms of Black organizing. I started a super PAC called the Alliance for Black Equality, and it came out of the fact that my, work as a political scientist led me to become a Democratic pollster. We were polling in and around the Biden ecosystem starting in October 2023. We're the first pollsters to tell the campaign that they were in trouble with black male voters. And we ran 12 tracking polls. We polled 35,000 black people from October 23 to November of 24. And, we could call, like the campaign would listen to us. They'd say, "Oh, professor, this is great. We like this thing on black maternal health that y'all did, but we don't like this other stuff," and it's like, so by last spring, we were like, they are going to lose because their win number with black people is like, they need about 85%. And they're just not getting anywhere near that with millennial and Gen Z black voters, not just men, also women, right? And so with the Alliance for Black Equality Project, we raised $300,000 in 5 weeks. We ran digital ads in 53 black zip codes. We touched 4 million black voters. The district we ran in, turnout for her didn't go down enough. All the while we were doing that, people were saying, "Why are you doing that? Kamala's got brothers." Like, what? And you have all these black politicians in the Democratic ecosystem that are like, "Oh man, like, we can't believe your polls." Then the NAACP came out with a poll that found what we'd been finding for 12 months, and we'd been talking to them, and they were like, "Oh, okay, well, maybe she is in trouble." But it's like 2 weeks before the election, right? So the dilemma there is that's a perfect example of people with their own agendas, with they're being embedded in these party apparatus, right? Not understanding what the collective is saying and what the collective needs, right? So that's one dilemma we have from an organizing standpoint. The second dilemma, and this is probably going to get me in trouble. You've known me for 25 years, so I never mind getting in trouble. The gendered politics in the black community have really created a dynamic whereby this notion of black women as the tired activists carrying everybody, and we all voted for Kamala, and now we're gonna like just sip our tea and let you. Okay, like you can do that, but you do understand that black women are the most educated segments of our community. They are succeeding the most in corporate America. They are living in the most integrated spaces, more than black men are, because of the nature of their employment. And so if Mr. Trump does something like overturn the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's going to be felt by black women first and worse than it will be felt by anyone else, right? So this notion of, black women had this, second sight, and they voted 92% for Kamala, and, black men only voted 82%. And so everybody else take a back seat. We're done. You can be done carrying everyone, but you will be harmed. And you need to organize now because this man intends to put all of us back into the fields. And it's not a joke. And so I'm very heartsick by our lack of urgency. And so now my project, the Alliance for Black Equality, we're trying to pass essentially mini civil rights acts in the 6 blue states. And it's very hard to get people to pay attention to that. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to go to my black excellence soiree and post that on LinkedIn." And I'm like, okay, but all that stuff's going to be illegal this summer if we don't act now, right? So, that's what I see happening. I think, all the people worried about listen, Kamala Harris was a fantastic candidate, a generational candidate. She was still very flawed in a couple of ways that cost her the election, right? Like they spent $1.5 billion essentially just talking to white women, and it didn't work. Their stance on the Middle East did not work. And a lot of voters stayed home because of that. Kamala Harris is a millionaire. She will be fine. She will have a plane or a helicopter out of here if the country goes down. Black women in the 92% will not. And we need to organize accordingly right now.
Coming up, more with political science professor Alvin Tillery Jr. He'll share what motivates him to continue his political work. And later, We'll look back at what protesters wanted in 2020 and what has actually happened. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we reflect on the 5 years since 2020's protest against police violence. We're still joined by Alvin Tillery Jr., a scholar of protest movements. He's professor of political science and founding director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. I asked Professor Tillery what the path forward looks like for people who want to see change in our current political environment.
Path forward looks like independent organizing that's not just protests. So first of all, the 501c3 organizations, the nonprofits, the Urban League, the NAACP, Reverend Sharpton's group, National Action Network, they're all great, but they are all limited in that they cannot engage in direct political organizing, or they'll lose their IRS tax code status. So we need to be investing in either a separate political party or what I'm talking about, the super PAC projects like the Alliance for Black Equality, right? Where you can engage. So like, the NAACP did a great job door knocking last cycle, but they couldn't even say vote for Kamala Harris. They're just telling Black people to vote. And then I and a lot of other folks are sitting over here being like, well, 15% of these brothers might vote for Trump. So if you knock on their door and tell them to go vote, and there's no vote for Kamala Harris message, you're actually mobilizing partly for Trump as well, right? So we need to get smart about that and invest in new institutions that are going to do that kind of direct work and not be reliant on corporate dollars. We need to step up as donors, right? If there are 25 million voting age Black folks and everybody gave $1 or $2, we would have enough money to run national campaigns that would be as impactful as something like American Bridge, which works on like a $70 million cycle budget, right? So people are, oh, I voted, I knocked on doors. Okay, have you given $1 or $5, like the Bernie Sanders model? So we need to do that. The other thing we need to do is go back to what I said about Dr. King and Miss Rosa in '64. All of these Black Democratic mayors and senators and state legislators, they work for us. We need to start leaning on them to put in place policy measures that will protect us. So what I'm trying to lead now is this audit law movement. I'm saying, okay, Mr. Trump says DEI disadvantages white men, and that's why he's got to kill it. Okay, so let's do an audit where we look at the hiring pool of all these jobs in the Fortune 500, and let's say, what's your merit criteria? Look at your pool, look at the outcomes. Did they hire on merit? Which groups are overrepresented? Include whites in that. Are white folks overrepresented? Okay, we don't have to talk about that now. Are Black women underrepresented? Oh, let's fix that. If we have the mayor of Chicago, the mayor of Philadelphia, the mayor of Baltimore, all writing executive orders where they say, if you want to be a contractor for the city of Chicago, you've got to do an equal opportunity audit every year and show us you're not discriminating against Black people. Why don't we do that? Because we don't ask our politicians to do that. Again, and part of that is that representation piece. As long as they show up and take photos with us at our gala, and we can post hashtag Black Excellence, on our February galas, we seem to be happy. Meanwhile, the grandchildren and children of Bull Connor and, Strom Thurmond and all those people are sitting around in their private clubs every weekend thinking about ways to take away our rights. And they have unlimited billionaires to write those checks. We've got to use our power where we have it. And I don't see us doing that.
I also hear a lot of people who talk themselves out of power, who say voting doesn't matter, the system is rigged, it will never matter. And that is the thing that gets me, because if it didn't matter, you wouldn't see the number of new policies on the books that are meant to make it more difficult, to make it illegal to give someone waiting in line in Georgia to vote a cup of water, or for an elder to have a chair while they're waiting to vote. All of that is key. And I hear a lot about what Black communities should be doing. And I also think, going back to 2020, and you talked about people reaching out to you, the number of white friends who reached out to me and said, "What do we do?" Right? Just tell me what to do. And part of it was this disappointment, like, I can't do that work for you. And there was also this thing that said, well, I am glad that people are willing to have a conversation. Let's then have a convo about what we do, not as allies, because that term means nothing, but as co-conspirators who are working toward this project of fortifying diversity and democracy.
Yeah.
What do you say to others who are like, what do we do in this moment? We feel overwhelmed, we feel paralyzed, but we know we have to do something. What is that message?
I mean, I would say, and again, I hope my sort of critique of the 501c3 groups isn't read as unfair. I would say support all those groups, right? Like the door knocking and all that's great, but also support groups that can engage in partisan activism. Work through your church. Donate your time to the local nonprofits that need legal defense from people suing them because they want to give a book scholarship to, they're like the, local Divine Nine group, and someone in the town's like, oh, you can't do that. Trump says you can't do that. Like these are the things that we can do. But at the highest level, what is going to protect us now is being noisy, and not noisy in the way that we were with the Black Lives Matter movement, but noisy in writing and pressuring the Democratic Party apparatus, which for some reason, keeps running on the same failed strategy. Listen, I think it's a miracle that like 45 to 50% of white folks in America solidly vote Democrat and are anti-racist, right? And I think if we can build on that base, get back to our 85 to 95% with Black folks, our 75% with Asians, we win every election with that coalition. But the Democrats seem so set on not owning that coalition. And this goes back to the Barack Obama problem, right? And so we've got to lean on them and let them know that we expect more from them. And if we can do that, that is our pathway into the power conversations. Because the politicians, frankly, often have a dearth of ideas. They're just running constantly to win, but they're not really running necessarily for any sense of value, or, they will calculate what they need to do to win, but they're not thinking big picture. How's this going to help the collective? So we've got to be a collective and tell them what we need, but we are running out of time. I do think that as soon as Mr. Trump sucks all the money that he needs out of the entitlement programs to fund the tax cut, they are going to overturn the Civil Rights Act. They have the votes to do that, right? And we've got to wake up. I mean, there's a reason why they're taking down the photos of the Tuskegee Airmen at the Department of Defense, and they're closing the National Museum for African American History and firing Carla Hayden. It is a white nationalist regime. And we cannot afford to sit back and sip tea because they are coming for all of us.
I can hear, Professor, all the things that keep you up at night, and the constant thinking about this, the historical context, the very present reality, and not just complaining about or talking about, but actually doing the work right where you are. What is the thing that gets you motivated in the morning to say, those who would support the attacks on civil rights, the supports on the communities that you are part of and that you care about, should tremble when your feet hit the floor? Because this is what Alvin Tillery is about to do today. What is that thing that gets you going in the morning?
Well, the Tillerys, both my European ancestors and my African ancestors, have been here since the 1720s. On my dad's side, Black men in my family got freedom by fighting in the Revolutionary War, right? We're in that tiny group. And, I just feel like after 325 years, I shouldn't have to worry about my little Black babies as they walk around, in America, right? So my high school daughter is thinking about what college she wants to go to. And her list is shortened by me because she will not be attending in a red state. Um, you know, there are certain schools that have rolled back their DEI programs where that's not an option for her, right? And she shouldn't have to think about that. I shouldn't have to think about that. And so what I am motivated by is a desire to get to a space where my two little beautiful black children will live in a world where there's less illiteracy about the facts and our history, and where they're safe. And they're as safe in, you know, Alabama as they are in, pristine Evanston, right? And that's what keeps me up. But I don't know that that's realistic. And I will also admit to your listeners that my family is preparing an exit strategy. Now I don't know that all 50 million black folks can have an exit strategy, but we are in a phase of democratic backsliding into authoritarianism, and that is going to be felt heavily by black people. And we need to investigate Ghana and South Africa. I mean, Trump is taking the Afrikaners here, so maybe he can get all of those folks out. We could go there, right? So we need to be thinking about these very real alternatives. And I hate to say that, but that's what I'm doing for my family.
I think what you're also saying is there are legacies to movements. There are legacies to uprisings and resistance, and to always be prepared. But it goes back to something you said when we first started this conversation. These are urgent times that demand urgent action and urgent commitment, and we appreciate you for reminding us. Alvin Tillery Jr. is professor of political science and founding director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy at Northwestern University. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Coming up, a journalist with the Marshall Project tells us whether the levels of police violence have changed in recent years. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at what's happened in the 5 years since the protest of 2020. Because George Floyd was murdered by a police officer, much of the focus of those 2020 protests centered on police violence. But what has actually changed in the last 5 years? It's a situation we're still trying to understand. After these interviews were recorded, the Justice Department dropped agreements it made with the cities of Minneapolis and Louisville. Those agreements are called consent decrees, and they were geared toward having both cities reform their police departments and practices. Minneapolis is the city where George Floyd was killed by a police officer, and Louisville is the city where Breonna Taylor was killed by law enforcement. Here to talk more about police reform is Jamiles Lartey. He's staff writer at the Marshall Project, and his work focuses on the criminal justice system. Jamiles, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
This is an episode where we are talking about the 5 years since the murder of George Floyd. And that has become one of those seminal moments in American history where people say, well, what did the protesters want? Or what was the demand? And your writing has made clear it was never about a singular demand. It's also looking at who was making those demands. Take us back to 2020 and share with us some of the things, plural, that people were demanding during that time.
Yeah, in 2020, there was a wide political and philosophical spectrum of hopes that came to the forefront with different and sometimes quite antagonistic goals. So for discussion purposes, I think we could sort them into three broad baskets. You could think about it as reformers, reimaginers, and abolitionists, each with different goals and different levels of success in the intervening years. So reformers are people who, and I'm speaking in broad strokes, of course, people focused on making police departments as they currently exist better through more or different training, more transparency, accountability, but not necessarily smaller, right? Not trying to change the footprint of law enforcement. So you're looking at some of the legislative or technocratic changes that we saw calls for in 2020, like banning chokeholds and neck restraints, or mandating body cameras and duty to intervene policies, where an officer needs to stop a fellow officer if they're becoming abusive in a situation. That would cover things like improved hiring, training, introducing de-escalation techniques. And so while the US Congress did not pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and did not pass any comprehensive policing reform at the federal level, state legislatures were extremely active. According to the National Council of State Legislatures, there were more than 4,500 police reform bills introduced in the years between 2020 and 2021, and hundreds of those were passed. And Connecticut's actually a great example, having passed or enacted legislation on chokeholds, on qualified immunity, on duty to intervene, on body cameras. At the federal level, both Donald Trump in his first term and Joe Biden signed policing executive orders. So that kind of covers a lot of the reform things that happened. Now, as for the reimaginers, a lot of that fell by the wayside, but some ideas have come from this philosophical approach saying, like, public safety is the goal. Are police the best way to get us there in every case? And if not, what could we try instead? One idea from that kind of basket that has been quite durable and influential is the alternative response and co-responder type programs, which send mental health professionals to certain 911 calls alongside of or instead of police. Then there's kind of a third basket that I would call the abolitionist group. And we're talking there about people who are calling for a rapid, dramatic reduction in the size, scope, and power of policing, and ultimately sought the end of traditional policing altogether as we know it. And I would say that abolitionists, we can certainly say that they moved the Overton window of the discussion, but I don't think by any metric you can say that much of what abolitionists wanted in 2020 they got. And a lot of those approaches and slogans, certainly, defund the police being the most notable among them, generated an immense amount of political backlash as well.
When you think about those three groups that you mentioned and the kinds of changes, as a journalist who is capturing in real time what's happening, what's your response to people who say, yes, we may have had some changes on the books, but in practice, how much reform actually happened?
Yeah, I think the question here, as ever, is, what do we mean by change? Like, how narrowly or broadly are we conceiving of that? The public consciousness has certainly changed. The political conversation has certainly changed, even if, I mean, it's also changed back, and maybe the pendulum has swung further in some ways than it was before George Floyd, but that too is change. Laws have changed, although some of them have changed back. If we're talking about the brass tacks question of police killings, the answer is unambiguously no, though. I mean, if you look at police killings per capita over the past decade or so, you see it as essentially flat, with a small but durable increase in recent years, basically starting around 2020.
I think it also, as I'm listening to you talk about this, it raises that question of who gets to define, one, what the goal is or what the goals are, but what are the metrics by which we define that? And again, I think it's why we wanted to have you in this conversation, because as a journalist, you are able to look at the system in its totality and also see the very interconnected way that these things happen. You have mentioned some of the changes that have happened at the local level and municipal level. What are you seeing when you look at cities across the U.S.? Are there certain cities that come to mind to say, yes, we've seen some of these changes, yes, we've seen reductions, and perhaps that becomes a model for how we think about what's happened since 2020?
I would preface my answer by noting that urban police violence, so we're talking about cities, is actually down over the last decade. So while suburban suburban and rural police violence has been increasing, cities writ large are doing better than they were when these, if we want to say at the sort of birth of the Black Lives Matter moment around 2013, 2014. And I should note there's actually more data on that phenomenon between about 2013 and 2020 than there is since George Floyd. So it's that it may not be completely current, but I think it's a question worth being aware of. But so in terms of specific cities, my attention goes to the cities that have had these high profile police violence incidents that have attracted the attention of the federal government in terms of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division coming in and performing investigations. Those often lead to consent decrees, which is basically just an agreement between the federal government and that city government to attempt certain reforms, and then a federal monitor keeps track of that. And so there's debate about how useful those are and how those may hamstring departments. But I think when you look in aggregate, a lot of those cities are doing better at the very least in terms of the number of police killings than they were doing before. I mean, two quick examples that come to mind is I live in New Orleans, a city that had certainly post Katrina was thought of as being perhaps one of the most violent, brutal, and lawless police departments in America. There were no police killings in New Orleans last year. One of the first stories I wrote in my journalism career, and I went back and looked at it this morning, and it's hard to believe that it was almost 10 years ago, was about Philadelphia, which was another city that had gone through this process and had, many police killings, many more police killings, I should say, before than after, and that number had come down. But part of what I was talking about in that piece was talking to people in some of the communities in Philadelphia that had experienced high levels of police violence and police brutality, and sort of weighing, well, so what on some level, right? Like, okay, the killings are down and that's great, but we still experience this kind of what those residents saw as over policing and brutal repression from that department.
What are you seeing in terms of the current White House administration and its relationship to some of the criminal justice issues that you write about and that you are concerned about?
If Trump in 2020 felt like a antagonist to some of these efforts, then it would be hard to come up with a term for what 2024 feels like, right? So I think it's worth noting that in 2020, at that moment, for all of Donald Trump's criticism and opprobrium towards the protest movement, he also signed a policing executive order. And so he wasn't utterly opposed to the idea that there were things about policing and the violence of policing that could potentially change, or that the federal government could have some role in trying to usher that in. Part of that executive order was aimed at creating a police misconduct database, right? So let's use that as our case in point, a federal police misconduct database. In 2024 version of Donald Trump, not only rescinded Joe Biden's executive order on policing, which was continuing the work of that effort towards a database, but has rescinded the Biden administration's executive orders that were trying to force some use of force restrictions on federal agents. Trump has this time around, during his first administration, Donald Trump and his administration were extremely slow and disinterested in using the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to look at police departments that may be violating people's civil rights, but they did occasionally do it. Under this iteration of the Trump administration, they've spelled out in no uncertain terms that that's not something that they're looking to do. And in many cases, they're trying to get out from under the agreements that are already operating in cities around the country. The 2025 Trump administration is also looking to cut funding to policing grants. And then, there have been some more proactive and you might even say unprecedented policy goals, most of which we don't know what the impact of them will be. But things like offering pro bono legal representation to officers accused of misconduct in their work. Like there's no playbook for that in terms of something that the federal government is looking to do on behalf of local law enforcement agents.
I think there will be no shortage of topics for you to write about with this administration in connection to these themes. But I am curious how all of the action that we're seeing around immigration, around deportation, the questions about whether people are entitled to due process, to habeas under this administration, how does that play into your broader view and broader approach to the criminal justice system and how you write about it?
It's kind of like trying to drink from a fire hose. I think that's probably a metaphor that people have used a lot in the opening 100 or so days of the Trump administration. It's certainly, as someone covering this space, it's a very kinetic moment. There's a lot happening, and it takes a lot more attention to try to get. I mean, I'll just give you an example, right? If you just think of the question that Donald Trump raised about potentially sending American citizens to foreign prisons. I mean, in any other moment, that would be perhaps the most consequential, most difficult to unpack, and it would be deserving of all of our attention for anyone who was in this space. But in this case, it was just one of 10 things that happened that week.
Looking forward, we're at the 5-year mark since the murder of George Floyd. As you said, we are inundated with ways that the criminal justice system is affecting people and will continue to evolve. Looking forward, what are one or two things that as a journalist, as a writer, that you say, we should be paying attention to this?
Can I come up with two? Oh, man. That's such a difficult question for me because, as you know, my primary responsibility with the Marshall Project is I write our weekly newsletter, and so much of what I do is really bopping from topic to topic. And I think a part of that work is built on the idea that it's all important, right? So if we're talking about the juvenile justice, I mean, I could easily pick two. I could say the juvenile justice system. We should be watching what we're doing to young people in our society, right? 12, 13, 14 years old, that we're in some states and in some instances locking them in rooms by themselves for 23 and a half hours, not giving them access to adequate water, nutrition, education, stimulation. I mean, that is a topic that is perfectly rational and valid as one of two things to be watching. But I could name, 20 others.
Jamiles Lartey is staff writer at the Marshall Project, covering various dimensions of the criminal justice system. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and Meg Fitzgerald. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.